Hello, Aaron. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. I'll just give a brief introduction and then we can get going on your presentation.
Fantastic.
Aaron Higashi is currently an adjunct faculty member at the College of Theology at Grand Canyon University. He studied philosophy in undergrad and took an interest in the relationship between ethics and biblical interpretation. He recently completed his PhD in the Bible, Culture, and Hermeneutics program at Chicago Theological Seminary, where he focused on Persian period texts of the Hebrew Bible, the interpretive method of ideological criticism, and the theology and ethics of womanist thinkers. His wife is a pediatrician, and he has 3 young daughters. He is in an interfaith marriage and has worked in religious education in both Christian and Jewish contexts, in addition to his university teaching. He's currently looking to adapt his dissertation on the intermarriage crisis of Ezra 10 for publication in the form of a book and several articles. He also enjoys fiction writing, jiu-jitsu, and spending time with his very busy family. The title of his paper is Everyday Resistance in Ezra 10. So Aaron, please take it away.
Oh, thank you. Allow me to share my screen here so that I can bring up this PowerPoint. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some things that I've been working on and thinking about for some time now. Let me begin by saying I think this is a rather dramatic and sorrowful episode that I'm going to be talking about today in the biblical book of Ezra. In my mind, it has interesting implications for the way that we think about the relationship between leaders and those they presume to lead in at least one small part of the ancient world. So allow me to set the scene for you here. The year is 458 BCE, and Ezra, a scribe in what is then, who is knowledgeable in what was then the Hebrew Bible, travels from the heart of the Persian Empire to the province of Judea, where he quickly dispenses with some administrative duties that he's been assigned, and then goes about instructing this newly formed Second Temple community in the text of his trade. Several months later, a group of unnamed leaders approach Ezra and tell him that they and many other people in the Second Temple community are guilty of ethnic intermarriage with a vaguely designated peoples of the lands. Ezra mourns this discovery and then launches into this prayer of confession where he articulates that the intermarriage crisis constitutes an existential threat to the Jewish people's covenantal relationship with Yahweh and thereby to their continued existence in the province of Judea. Ezra is encouraged to take decisive action to rectify this crisis and for the people of Judea to rededicate themselves to Yahweh, and he does exactly this. Ezra summons all the people throughout the wider region to the temple courtyard under threat of property confiscation and expulsion from the community. Once the people are gathered together in a large assembly, Ezra announces that all the men of the assembly who have married foreign women must divorce these women and send them and any children they have had by them away to fates unknown. The assembly responds to Ezra's divorce imperative over the course of 4 verses, chapter 10, verses 12 through 15. And then the remainder of the chapter lists more than 100 men who are guilty of this ethnic intermarriage, and as a result, who probably do exactly what Ezra has demanded that they do and send away these wives and children. This is, so far as I know, the only narrated example of divorce in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it is a forced mass divorce imposed by a community's leader on those whom they presume to lead. What is both curious and surprising about this event, though, is its outcome. First, for a problem that's supposed to constitute an existential threat to the community and that is supposed to require immediate and unprecedented action to remedy, the fact that there are only 100 men involved is somewhat odd, given that the population of the Second Temple community at the time is probably close to 100,000. That would mean that there's only 0.1% of the population who are among the men that are guilty of this offense. That doesn't seem like a systemic or even prevalent issue. Indeed, the list of guilty offenders presented in Ezra chapter 10 is so small that it has led some scholars to speculate that the list is incomplete in its present form and was originally much longer. Further, given that a significant percentage of the names on the list of guilty offenders are from priestly families, it would seem that this problem, to the extent that it is a problem among those people who came up with the idea that it was a problem to begin with. And as a result of the assembly of rural people who are threatened to gather and submit to this divorce imperative is almost beside the point. It seems like the priests could have just handled this in-house among themselves and left out these coercive divorces of rural peoples. Therefore, a question that we might ask is, what happened between the beginning of Ezra chapter 10, where Ezra was encouraged to take drastic action against an existential threat, and the end of Ezra chapter 10, which reports this rather anemic result? We might wonder whether Ezra and his supporters overestimated the nature and scope of the intermarriage crisis and only realized this after the fact. But it seems like if Ezra and his supporters had a growing awareness of the true nature and scope of the crisis as it was resolved, and it was resolving in a way that they didn't like, they would have simply altered the process to bring about a more favorable result. Consequently, we need an alternative explanation where Ezra and his supporters are not the primary cause of the underwhelming result, and where even if they do that become aware of the crisis's true scope in the midst of its resolution, they're not in a position to change the result. And that alternative explanation that I hope to provide is that it's not that Ezra and his supporters overestimated the nature and scope of the crisis. No, they probably got it right. Rather, I want to argue that the assembly Ezra forced to gather and submit to these mass divorces actually resisted Ezra in ways that are so subtle that neither Ezra nor generations of interpreters after him noticed. Now, if we're going to argue something like this, we need a method specifically designed for detecting the subtle exercise of agency in marginalized group like the assembly in Ezra 10. Fortunately, such a method has already been proposed and described in some detail by biblical scholar Gail Yee. Yee's method combines tools from ideological criticism and insights from Black feminist thought to help nuance our conception of marginalization, but the heart of the method employs the work of cultural anthropologist James Scott. Scott spent years in Northwest Malaysia studying the lives of farmers during a transformational period in their economic base when technological innovations and new agricultural practices were imposed on these farmers from outside sources, often resulting in increased unemployment, poverty, and suffering. Scott observed that the farmers did not passively accept these changes, but neither did their actions ever rise to the level of conventional rebellion. In an effort to describe what he observed, Scott posited a conceptual distinction between what he called traditional resistance and what he called everyday resistance. Traditional resistance is resistance that is hierarchically organized. It's frequently militaristic and violent. It's aimed at achieving systemic change and collective goals. Everyday resistance is the opposite of all these things. It's often unnoticed, decentralized, and deorganized. It's nonviolent usually, and it's aimed at achieving temporary relief from exploitation for individuals rather than collectives. Traditional resistance is the kind of resistance that shows up in the official documentation and histories of superordinate classes, and also the kind of resistance that tends to, unfortunately, be summarily crushed by those same superordinate classes. Everyday resistance is less likely to be crushed by contrast, both because it's more difficult for superordinate classes to perceive and then to record it happening, but also because there's no real group to crush, even when it is perceived. Scott then goes on to distinguish between two types of everyday resistance, which he calls routine resistance and symbolic resistance. Routine resistance targets the material resources of a superordinate class and their ability to enforce exploitative practices on subordinate groups. Examples of routine resistance include foot dragging, taking longer to do than what you're told to do, false compliance, not actually doing what you're told to do, feigned ignorance, pretending like you don't understand, and petty theft and sabotage. Symbolic resistance targets the ideological resources of a superordinate class and their ability to enforce a coherent worldview that justifies their exploitation of subordinate groups. Examples of symbolic resistance include slander, rumors, ideological dissimulation, and the maintenance of a hidden transcript, which is basically an alternative story of the people's history that is invisible to those who are oppressing them. I think there are several examples of this everyday resistance in the assembly's response to Ezra in chapter 10, verses 12 through 15. And I think that these instances of everyday resistance are ultimately what caused the underwhelming result of Ezra's mass divorce. That is to say, I think Ezra and his supporters believed there were and then aimed to eliminate potentially thousands of ethnic intermarriages, but because of the assembly's everyday resistance, the end result was drastically smaller and also concentrated around the very priests who demanded the divorce to begin with. So let me describe for you three instances of everyday resistance in the assembly's response. Number one, foot dragging. First, after Ezra announces that the men of the assembly must divorce their wives, and the assembly initially responds with what seems like an affirmation. They say in chapter 10, verse 12, "We must do as you have said, but," and as you know, anything that comes before a but doesn't really matter, "but the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open, nor is this a task for one day or for two, for many of us have transgressed in this manner. The assembly uses the weather and the ostensible severity of their own transgression as an excuse to change the mass divorce from a single decisive event to one that will take place over a long and drawn out process. Indeed, in verse 17, we learn that it took 3 months for these marriages to be investigated and for the divorces to be enacted. This lengthy process recommended by the assembly contrasts sharply with the encouragement to act decisively that Ezra received at the beginning of the chapter, and Ezra's own demand that the assembly enact these divorces now. One can only imagine that as the sheer weight of time and months of winter weather bore down on the people involved in this process, that the original conviction which inspired their divorces would begin to lose its momentum, likely resulting in significantly fewer divorces than if they had all been enacted immediately and or over a shorter period of time. The assembly also exhibits foot dragging in another way. After noting the weather and the severity of their transgression, the assembly also recommends what might seem like a helpful and efficient act of delegation. In verse 15, the assembly says that they will send elders and judges from their own villages to represent themselves and to aid in arbitrating these divorces. Ezra and his supporters might have been happy for the assistance, but this means that there is no longer just Ezra and his supporters deciding what does and what does not constitute an illicit intermarriage, but also people whose ideologies of ethnicity and identity are probably closer to the assemblies than they are to the priestly class of the Second Temple complex. These elders and judges may have been able to secure results in months of deliberations that are more favorable to the assembly. Regardless, it would involve more cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, and as Joseph Blenkinsop has pointed out, the most common way of shelving a proposal is to send it to committee. The assembly sends it to committee, decreasing its ultimate efficiency rather than increasing it. Number 2, false compliance. A second potential example of everyday resistance utilized by the assembly in Ezra 10 is false compliance. In verse 15, after telling Ezra that they will send elders and judges to assist in the process of the divorces, the assembly says that they will cooperate in the process until, quote, the fierce wrath of God on this account is averted from us. Now, doing something until Yahweh isn't mad anymore simply isn't the same thing as doing something until it's done. This allows for the possibility that the assembly will cooperate, but only to a point. And what would that point be? How does the assembly or Ezra or literally anyone else know when Yahweh isn't angry anymore? I will recommend a potentially subversive answer to this question, and I think it's implied in the weather that the assembly previously mentioned. So let me back up for just a moment. In Ezra chapter 9, verse 1, where the unnamed leaders first brought the intermarriage crisis to Ezra's attention, the unnamed leaders said that the peoples of the land that they had intermarried with had practices comparable to those of ethnic outsiders from Israel's past, namely the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. That list of prescribed ethnic groups combines groups from several previous lists in the Pentateuch with whom the people of Israel were not to intermarry. It includes several groups that are unique to Deuteronomy, indicating that the theology of Deuteronomy greatly influenced these unnamed leaders' conception of this crisis. One example of this list of prescribed ethnic groups can be found in Deuteronomy 7. In verses 3 and 4, after listing 7 such groups that the people of Israel are not supposed to intermarry with, the text goes on to say that if they do intermarry with them, they will turn to idolatry and Yahweh's anger will burn against them, the same kind of language. 4 chapters later, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 17, we get some additional information about what Yahweh's anger might actually look like in practice. Allow me to very quickly read the verses in full. This is Moses speaking about Yahweh's commands. He says, if you will only heed his every commandment that I am commanding you today, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and with all your soul, then he will give you rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain, and you will gather in your grain and your wine and your oil, and you will have grass in your field for your livestock, and you will eat your fill. Take care, or you will be seduced into turning away, serving other gods and worshiping them. For then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will not yield its produce. Then you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving to you. These verses indicate that the meteorological status of the land, the weather, and the covenantal status of the people directly correspond to one another, and at least the theology here in Deuteronomy that influenced this unnamed leader's conception of the crisis. If the people intermarry with prescribed ethnic groups, then they have not kept Yahweh's commands. Yahweh will be angry and there will be no rain. But in Ezra chapter 10, there is rain. And if there is rain, then Yahweh can't be angry. And if Yahweh can't be angry, then the people could not have intermarried with prescribed ethnic groups and broken Yahweh's commands. To put it even more simply, if there is rain, then Yahweh's anger must already have been averted, and the assembly is no longer under any obligation to cooperate in the process of mass divorce. When the assembly says that they will cooperate until Yahweh's anger is averted, they are saying they will not actually cooperate at all. This is false compliance. Number 3, ideological dissimilarity. Third and finally, another example of everyday resistance the assembly makes use of is ideological dissimilarity. Scott mentions that one of the basic tests of whether or not a subordinate class has been mystified by the ideology of a subordinate class is whether or not the subordinate class is enslaved on the level of ideas, and thereby articulates their socioeconomic situation in the same language as those who are oppressing them. To express ideological dissimilation is to demonstrate variance of ideas by expressing variance of. Basically, does the assembly agree with Ezra's characterization of the intermarriage crisis or not? And I think the answer to that question is no, for the simple reason that when the assembly says they will cooperate until the anger of God has been averted, they explicitly say the anger of our God. The danger of ethnic intermarriage is consistently presented in the Pentateuch and the following Deuteronomistic history as the danger of adopting foreign religious practices via marriage, committing idolatry, and thereby violating the people of Israel's covenantal relationship with Yahweh, which demands that Yahweh alone is worshipped. When the unnamed leaders compare the practices of the peoples of the land to the practices of these old ethnic outsiders, is the fear that it is a fear of idolatry and covenant violation that they are invoking. Does the assembly agree that whatever intermarriages they are involved in have led to idolatry? No, because they uniformly confess that Yahweh is their God. And that confession has always been one of, if not the, defining ethnic differences between Israel and its neighbors. This is why in Deuteronomy 26, when the people of Israel swear their yearly oaths of citizenship, it is an oath to adopt a story as one's own, namely the story of the Exodus and Sinai experience. If the people of the assembly have adopted this story as their story and thereby this God Yahweh as their God, then there's no evidence of idolatry. Whatever else might be happening in the assembly's marriages, this simple confession seems to preclude the possibility that there is idolatry and therefore that there is an active existential threat to the Second Temple community. The assembly disagrees with Ezra and his supporters and is thereby ideologically dissimilar from them. As a result, the assembly is less likely to uncritically adopt Ezra's worldview, which justifies the assembly's marginalization, and much more likely to resist that worldview and its exertions of power by whatever means is available to them. In conclusion, I think the best explanation for the unexpected result of Ezra's mass divorce is not a failure in leadership, but rather the subtle, everyday resistance of the assembly. The assembly employed, in Scott's language, the weapons of the weak, foot dragging, false compliance, and ideological dissimulation, to attack and to wear down the material and ideological resources of the priesthood classes that imposed an exploitative burden on them. And in so doing, they have reduced the ultimate effectiveness of that burden and even managed to reflect a significant percentage of its force back on those who had imposed it. I further think that James Scott's concept of everyday resistance can be a fruitful way of examining otherwise unnoticed agency of marginalized groups throughout the ancient world. And I do not think that any analysis of the relationship between leaders and those they presume to lead, or about who has power in these relationships, will ever be complete without considering the possibility of this everyday resistance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Higashi. That was very, very interesting. And when I was in grad school, my area of specialization was royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia. So the idea of power dynamics between rulers and or those in power and those being subjugated is near and dear to my heart. And also as a parent, the idea of the foot dragging form of resistance is something I am intensely familiar with, as I am sure you are. Can you think of
today?
Oh, they're masters. My 4-year-old in particular is just perfect.
Yeah.
Can you think of any, and this is very much off the top of your head, so no problems at all if it's not something you can speak on. Can you think of any other events either in the Hebrew Bible or in history in general where you think that this form of resistance could be usefully looked at?
If we're talking about history in general, I mean, Scott himself raises the example of African-American slaves and gives several examples of ideological dissimulation and foot dragging and false compliance in records of slaves in sort of pre-antebellum South. So I think that would be a very easy place to sort of apply the same method. As far as places in the Hebrew Bible are concerned, I have part of the problem is that you need not only an instance in which you have a subordinate class subjected to a superordinate class, but you also need some evidence that they are engaging in foot dragging. And that's hard to come by precisely because so often it is hidden from the relatively elite scribal classes that are putting these stories together. So I think this is probably one of the few instances in the Hebrew Bible where you get a very clear look at that. But I am certainly open to the possibility and will continue to look for other examples in which you can make this case so that I can write some articles and books about it. But I'm sure there are. I would just need to look some more for it.
Well, thank you very much. We actually do not have any questions from you from the audience.
Okay.
We have a couple of minutes. Is there anything that you wanted to elaborate on and didn't have time for in the presentation?
One of the most interesting ways that this sort of concept is being applied today, there's a womanist author named Cheryl Anderson who has applied this same story and sort of a subversive reading of the same story for thinking about sort of segregation and racial intermarriage in the 20th century. And so I think these continue to be in some ways hot button issues as the lines between communities and what sort of agency do marginalized communities, can they take, is justified for them to take, is expected for them to take in the face of this kind of power bearing down on them and disrupting their relations. So I think there's a lot here that could very well be applicable to people in religious communities today to sort of think about. And I don't think it would take too much work to sort of to flesh that out. So I think it has a lot of value. It's not just a conversation constrained to something that happened 2,500 years ago.
Thank you very much. And we do have one question just for clarification. You mentioned a couple of authors, I believe, a little bit earlier on, and we're being asked for the full names that you shared.
The cultural anthropologist who wrote the book is James Scott. The name of his book is Weapons of the Weak. That's the cultural anthropologist that these distinctions between everyday and traditional resistance come from. He's written several other books, and biblical scholars have sometimes gotten their hands on them, but I think he's an underappreciated figure. There's also Gail Yee. She was just recently, I think a couple of years ago, president of the Society of Biblical Literature. And she was the one who authored the article that originally sort of recommended James Scott's work as a method for biblical scholars to get at the agency of marginalized groups.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
That is actually all we have. So Dr. Higashi, thank you again for a very interesting and engaging presentation.
I'm very happy.
This is the end of the current session.